What is going on, gunfighters? Saddle up for today's episode of Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, the right way with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. To establish some street cred, I'll throw in the bio. I'll roll into a quick abbreviated bio and then into the main topic. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is number one in my life. I grew up hunting and fishing in the backwoods of the southeastern United States at a very early age. Some of my earliest memories are with firearms. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. By God's grace, He got me through that safely. After that, I served as an instructor, an urban warfare instructor and a desert warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps. I also served with the LAPD, both full-time as a sworn police officer and in some more specialized assignments, as well as serving in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard. I've been a FBI firearms instructor, still am an FBI firearms instructor, have been for a lot of years, also NRA certified and some other three-letter government agency certified. I've been a private contractor for a three-letter government agency I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. By God's grace, He got me through all that in one piece, not because I'm better, but because He chose to have grace and mercy on me. I've been a professional hunter and guide. Professionally hunted things like buffalo and elk. Not many people today can say they've done that, but I'm blessed to be able to say that I have. I've hunted everything from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to gray squirrel on the East Coast to prairie dog on the West Coast and elk and bear and wolf and slain all manner of beast. A state rifle and pistol champion a few times over in a few different disciplines. Now those experiences, it's not because I'm bigger or badder. Certainly not bigger. In fact, I met one of the patrons in real life, and he said something to the effect of, "I thought you'd be bigger." Reminded me of that William Wallace movie, where he's like, "Oh yeah, if William Wallace were here, he'd shoot lightning bolts out of his rear end." Well, I'm not William Wallace, but I am the person that did all those things in the bio. But not because I'm bigger or badder. I don't think that I survived when many other young good men did not. I give all the glory and all the credit to God, all the talents and experiences that He's given me and the things that He's let me live through. I hope to use them to glorify God and to help you today. So if I boast in anything, it's not in my strength, it's in that God had mercy on me and saved me because He had a purpose for me. And hopefully I can use those talent, skills, and abilities to serve you today. So, I don't normally do a lot of housekeeping stuff, but I feel I should in this episode. If you haven't noticed, I've been doing quite a few mobile episodes. That's because I've been driving across country, and I might be driving back pretty soon, I hope. Back to free America. Back to well west of the Missouri. But either way, you probably get some more mobile episodes. So the audio quality's not as good. I haven't heard a lot of complaints. I appreciate that. I appreciate you being patient. Especially I haven't heard any complaints from the patrons, and they're the ones that are paying so you can get content. So just realize that. If you don't know, to make a long story short, the wife has a childhood friend who went in the hospital with something really serious. She's been in there a while, and she needed help taking care of her kids. My wife has been back here for a long time, and I thought it was time for me to drive back and see her. So that's why I'm here. If you guys care about that kind of stuff. If you want to help support this show, you can go to Patreon, become a patron. I would appreciate it. If you don't want to do that and you like the show, at least make sure you've left some stars, leave a review, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Okay, with that, today's episode. When does it make sense to modify a gun or not? You shouldn't always modify every gun. When does it make sense to modify a gun? And if you are in the camp of, I'm going to modify this gun, when does it make sense to DIY, do it yourself? And when does it make sense to pay a professional? It's a pretty important episode. Maybe not the most entertaining, but I think really important content. So let's dive into that. Now, a real clear answer might be you're not allowed to. Whatever department, whatever police department, they issue you, let's say, one of the worst handguns of our era. They issue a Glock 22, 40 cal Glock. And they say, ye shall sally forth and carry this gun, no modifications allowed. We've given you night sights. You got a Glock 22 with night sights. What else could you need? Right? Then your decision's been made for you, right? That's what you got. And you've agreed to that job with that gun. So, I don't know that I would advise you to do that modification if they say you shall not do it and you've agreed to play by their rules. You've agreed to handicap yourself in future engagements, then you agreed to that. So that decision may have been made for you. There is often this argument, so I'm going to give it to you both ways. There's often the argument for, let's say, concealed carry guns, because for the vast majority of U.S. civilians, that's probably the thing you're going to use in a defensive encounter. It's probably not going to be your cool whiz-bang AR-15. It's very rare that those get used in a legitimate defensive use. I know they can, and I know that they have, but it's not nearly as common as a handgun. So let's talk about CCW handgun. There's the two camps. There's the camp that you should never modify a factory gun for defensive use because they're going to throw you in Alcatraz. Some DA is going to just beat you over the head with the penal code, and you are going to be next to Al Capone in Alcatraz on bread and water rations because you dared to put a different spring in your gun. And there is the camp that says you should put in whatever parts make it best for you to hit the target because you're trying to stop somebody that's trying to kill you or somebody else, right? That's the time to use deadly force, to stop somebody else from taking a life. Now, I'm not an executioner. I don't think you're an executioner. So the only time you're probably taking a life is if they are actively engaged in taking human life. It's reasonable and prudent to believe that you or somebody else in a similar position believes that a life is in imminent danger. And if you have to engage that target, you might want every advantage to help you hit that target. I think that's a legitimate thing. So you might say, and rightly so, these sights help me see better. They help me shoot better. This red dot helps me shoot better. This trigger has less creep and over travel. Ergo, it helps me get multiple shots on target quicker. It allows me to not just get one shot on target quicker, but multiple follow-up shots, because the vast majority of handgun rounds are not fatal. And you may just pull your gun out and the guy stops. You may shoot him once and the guy stops. You may have to shoot him multiple times. You don't really know. The ability to get fast, accurate hits on target is a good thing. So you might say any modification that helps me do that is a good thing. And I would agree with that. But, again, you go back to that other argument. Some DA is going to metaphorically take a cat of nine tails and flog you because you dared to put a different spring in your gun. And you might say that's totally possible. You might think that it's not possible. You may be in the camp that it's possible but not likely, and that's the camp that I'm in. If you have a good shoot, you have a good shoot. I'm not aware of any statute, so show it to me in law. Show it to me in the penal code, right? I studied law. I'm not a lawyer. I've studied law as a cop. I was a police officer. Fairly familiar with penal code. Show me a penal code that says somebody with a concealed carry permit cannot modify their gun. Okay, could they try to make the case that you were just trigger happy and did all kinds of modifications to your gun? They could try to make the case, but they have to make it stick. That in and of itself is not a violation. So you have to decide, do you want your gun to be better at hitting a target, a bad guy that's trying to kill you or somebody else, or do you want to be afraid of the DA? That's up to you. Again, if it's a good shoot, if somebody was trying to, let's say somebody just to make a real easy picture, somebody had somebody down on the ground and they were about to chop their head off with a battle axe. And you shoot the dude right as he brings the axe up and it's at full extension way up high in the air. And he falls backwards and he's dead. And you save that person's life. Could they try to make the case? Well, it would have been a good shoot, but since you put a 3.5 pound Glock connector in your gun and it was 5.5 pounds, you are going to prison for a long time. They could try to make that case. But again, they could try and make a lot of things, but you have to make it stick. And there may be a case out there somewhere where a jury convicted somebody and gave them a worse sentence. I'm not aware of it. And even if it happened once, that's probably not grounds to change your mind one way or the other. What's common? Is it common for that to even come into play? Either way, it's something to consider. So that's another reason you may or may not want to modify your gun for legality. So let's say you've gotten the legality out of the way. You're not afraid of a litigious ramification. Then you still have to ask, is this modification worth it? A couple of things to consider. Often a modification can, let's just stick with the trigger, it can make the trigger pull less, but can also make the gun less reliable. For instance, in a lot of striker-fired guns, lightening the literal striker spring, the spring that shoves the striker forward to hit the back of the primer, that can give you a better trigger pull. It can give you a lighter trigger pull. However, it also means that you're hitting the back of that firing pin with less force, which means you can be prone to more light strikes, meaning click and no bang. You pull the trigger and nothing happens, which means now you got to fix the malfunction. Is that worth it? If it's a competition gun, you may decide yes, because I know that I shoot federal primers because they're the softest and I'll keep my firing pin channel clean. And if it does happen, then I just maybe drop down 1 or 2 points in the stack, or I have a really bad day in the competition, but I'm not going to die, and nobody else is going to die. You may decide that is worth it for you. You're getting a better trigger pull every time, even though you have the potential to have more malfunctions. If that's a carry gun, I'm going to say that's a modification you may not want to make, right? Because sure, you get a little bit lighter trigger pull, but if somebody is literally running at you with a knife trying to kill you, or we go back to that axe scenario, somebody's about to swing an axe and kill somebody, and you have a malfunction, by the time you get it fixed, you or that other person could be dead. Right? So probably not worth it there. I'm going to say for me, if that were me, I would say probably not worth it. I'll deal with a little bit heavier trigger pull with a proper striker. And that's just a real common one because a lot of people carry striker-fired guns. So that's a case where I would say, even though it's legal and I don't really care about the litigious nature of a DA, I think that's a bad trade. I don't want a little bit lighter trigger for a little bit less reliable gun. In that case, you may say, I'm going to keep the same striker spring, but I'm going to put in a 3.5 connector. If you're not familiar, that's a Glock part. Usually they come with a normal connector, which they say about 5.5. That's very optimistic. And the 3.5 connector is also optimistic. I don't think it brings it anywhere to 3.5 pounds. But the old 3.5, what they will call a race connector, you may decide you want to do that and leave the original spring in there, which I've never heard of the 3.5 connector on its own being any more or less reliable. So, again, you may decide, do I want to modify and get a better trigger? Yes, because Glock trigger is like chewing on gravel. So I do want a better trigger, but I don't want to give up reliability. So I'm not going to lighten the striker spring, but I am going to put a 3.5 connector in. Keep in mind, lighter is not always better. And lighter being better is not always the same. Like, I think a good hunting trigger is 2.5, 3.5 pounds. I think a good carry trigger, if it's a single action gun with a hammer and a safety, is around 3.5 to 4 pounds. So it's different. I don't want lighter than that. Especially if I'm like in the wintertime wearing gloves and stuff like that, because it can be hard to discern. Right? So lighter is not always better, and lighter is not the only part of a trigger that's important. I would rather have a heavier but really good crisp trigger than a mushy, rotten carrot feeling of a trigger that's kind of just mushy and crackly and then sometime it breaks, like I would call a Glock trigger. I would rather have a heavy 1911 trigger than a really light Glock trigger. Even if the scale, even if let's say the 1911 trigger was 4 pounds, but really crisp, and the Glock trigger was 2.5 pounds, but it again was mushy and garbage and just a bunch of creep, a bunch of take up, a bunch of different stages, and then it breaks somehow. So light is not always, and it oftentimes is. A lot of people will just look by what's on paper and they'll say, "Ooh, this." Some people will just look at the specs. So I was about to say in a catalog, but a lot of people probably do it online now. I'm looking on the specs on the website, and this one's got a 0.5 pound lighter trigger. It must be better. No, it just means it's lighter. It may or may not be better. For instance, I'll call somebody out. I don't take sponsors on the show. The FN509 that's got a horrible trigger. It makes a Glock trigger seem good, and that's hard to do. I don't know if it's a lighter or heavier than a Glock trigger, but even if it's the same, even if they both say 5.5, that trigger is horrendous. Again, it's hard to be worse than a Glock trigger. You think you got to try, but the FN509 I really don't like for a lot of reasons, and that's one of them. That trigger is just, it's like they wanted to make it hard to shoot. They didn't want you to hit a target. It's bad. And it may be on paper lighter than a Glock trigger. I don't know. I'm not looking at it right now. I'm just saying that light is not the only aspect to a trigger. There's take up, there's clean break, there's post travel. There's all kinds of things. If you're going in the rifle world, do you want a single stage? Do you want a double stage? Some people really like double stages. I really don't. I like a single stage. But, that really depends on you. Some people have trained so much on one that they like one over another. But a lot of times, especially when we talk about fire control groups, which is going to be in a handgun, like your lower parts, your frame, all those internal parts in there, or in like an AR-15, those lower trigger components, the parts in the lower parts kit, when you start messing around with those parts, you can get less reliable. If you have a mil-spec trigger with actual mil-spec quality parts, not just it came in a box and it says mil-spec, but I mean like made by Colt, made by FN, really good quality springs, quality components. If you have that trigger, it's going to be bad. It's going to be a bad trigger, like a military Colt M16, which I'm very familiar with, or an FN M16. Their triggers are bad, right? Just standard military Colt M4 triggers are bad. They're not good at all. But they're reliable. They can break, but it's rare. Like, they're really, really reliable. If I want to go cheap, back in the day when there weren't a lot of extra aftermarket triggers, you used to just get just a little bit of history lesson for you guys. Back in the day when you wanted a lighter trigger in an AR, there may not have been any aftermarket drop-in triggers. So one of the things you might do is take the hammer spring and bend the forks on it or cut one off. And that would absolutely give you a little bit better trigger pull. But it's also going to make the hammer get thrown forward with less force. But because there's less force on the hammer, it makes the sear release a little bit smoother. Forgive me if I'm getting too gunsmith nerdy on you. But that trigger spring being lighter will give you a better trigger. But it will in turn also mean that hammer, and yes, AR-15s do have a hammer. It's that part that swings up in the lower. It's a hammer-fired gun. That hammer is going to launch forward with less force, which means there's less force hitting the back of that primer, which again can have the potential to induce more malfunctions. Is that worth it to you? If it's a home defense carbine, I'm going to say no. If it's a competition carbine or a prairie dog shooting carbine, or even a coyote shooting carbine, I'd say yeah. Why not? Because if you get a click, maybe the coyote runs away by the time you clear the malfunction. Okay, coyote's probably not going to come and eat your face off. If it's for a competition, and again, you got to go tap, rack, bang, and that day you had one malfunction, not that big a consequence. If it's a home defense gun and somebody is shooting down your hallway at you and you have a malfunction, that's a bad day. So even the same modification, sometimes worth it, sometimes not. I would even say in something like that where you're either going to have a clean malfunction or not, it's not really going to affect. You're not going to really wound an animal. It's not like if the gun goes off, you're going to wound the animal any more likely than you would without it. Even in a hunting scenario, I'd probably take that trade-off. Here's where I wouldn't take a trade-off in modification. Something as simple as mounting a scope. If you don't know what you're doing mounting a scope, meaning like you don't lap your rings, or you don't know if you need to lap your rings, or you don't have a torque wrench, again, when does it make sense to pay somebody? Then. If it's for even a hunting gun, especially a defensive gun, but a hunting gun. If you don't have a torque wrench, you know how to apply proper torque, you can absolutely mess up a scope. And if you crush a scope and it won't hold zero, and you go out and wound a deer or an elk because of your own stupidity, that's not a good trade-off. I would not do that. I would pay somebody, and not just pay any sporting goods store, because a lot of times they're just going to throw it on too, but pay somebody that knows how to properly mount a scope. I'd say it's worth it if it's for a good hunting gun. I don't, and I'm not saying this because I think it, I'm saying it because the Bible says so. Aren't you more valuable than many sparrows? How much more valuable are you than a sheep? Right? A human life is more valuable, so especially a defensive gun. But we are called to be stewards, keepers of the earth, tillers of the ground, keepers of the earth, watching over God's creation. So I don't think that an animal life is anywhere near as valuable as a human life, but it's still valuable. I don't want to see an animal suffer. I don't want to see an animal wounded. I don't want to see it get shot in the guts and run away and die a slow, miserable death. I don't want that at all. So if you don't know how to mount a scope and you crush it and it won't hold zero, but you think it does because you went out and zeroed it once, and you're going to go hunting with it, and you wound an animal because of your own stupidity, because even if it's the gun, it's still you because you broke it. So when does it make sense to pay somebody? Then. If you don't know how to properly mount a scope, pay somebody to do it. That's when it makes sense. Going back to the trigger, if it's a drop-in trigger in an AR, if you can't put in a drop-in trigger in an AR, you probably shouldn't be shooting an AR-15. Just being real with you. I'm not saying it's not your right as an American or whatever, but I'm just saying if you can't figure out how to drive out 2 pins, drop a trigger in and drive in 2 pins, you probably may ought to reevaluate whether or not you should be carrying a deadly weapon or have a deadly weapon in the home. I'm just saying that to be real because it's super simple. You may decide you want to pay somebody else because you don't have the time, but if you have the intellectual capacity to wield a deadly weapon, you can probably drive out 2 pins, drop a trigger in, and drive in 2 pins. So if it's a drop-in trigger, you probably do that yourself. If it's anything to do with hand fitting, and there's any kind of consequence to it going wrong, meaning like defensive use, hunting use, anything like that, I would pay somebody else to do it if you're not competent and you're not really going to test it, and know yourself. Like if you're going to do a trigger job on a hunting rifle by doing some filing, putting some different springs in, you're going to dry fire with it and frame with it several times to test it before you go out on a hunt. You're not just going to put in a new trigger, take it to the range once, and go hunting. Then I would say go for it if you think you can tackle it. If you're not sure, especially if it's an expensive gun, pay somebody else, because you might be paying even more to pay them to fix what you've broken. A part that they would probably do fine, like, smoothing out a sear with some polishing compound, you may go too far, and now your gun is going off multiple times when you pull the trigger. That's bad. I don't care how cool it looks on TV or whatever, you don't want that. You don't want your gun to go off more than once when you pull the trigger, unless you have a legit machine gun. That is bad, that is dangerous. So something like that where there's no set thing. It's not like you do this exactly this. It's not like when you're polishing a sear, it says polish it exactly this much. Here's a classic example, like a 1911. Everything in there, well, not everything, but a lot of things in there really have to work together, kind of like a Swiss watch, much more so than like a Glock. A lot of the Glock parts are like standalone. You mess up one part, you replace that part. With the 1911, a lot of that stuff has to play nicely together. Think of the 1911 like a symphony. When it's all playing together well, it's beautiful, beautiful to behold. When one thing is off key or out of tune, it's bad. And it can make the whole thing go off the rails. So, a 1911, again, more like a symphony. If you look at looking at an exploded view, an exploded view of a Glock, an exploded view of a 1911. An exploded view, I thought that was a common term, but apparently it's not. It just means like a diagram with all the pieces laid out where they come from. Look at the number of moving parts in a 1911 versus a Glock. That 1911 is very, very complex. If you don't really know what you're doing, or you're really not mechanically inclined, meaning like you rebuild carburetors or you rebuild engines and you can hand file a part to fit. If you're not comfortable with that, probably don't do anything other than maybe change the sights on your 1911. Take it to somebody else. You can really cause some problems. Again, because all those things have to work well together. You may replace one part and you have problems in a completely different part of the gun now because of the way it has to interact properly. So a 1911 is a case where if you don't really know what you're doing, you're not really mechanically inclined, take it to a gunsmith. Right? If it's a 1911, take it to a gunsmith. If you're not a competent gunsmith yourself. Talking about doing work on Glocks. Glocks are some of the easiest guns to work on, but even that, if I was talking about those parts and you knew exactly what I was talking about, probably you want to go tackle it, as long as you're not just going to do it and carry it for defense. You're actually going to test it and try it out. But if you're like, I don't even know what a striker spring is, then probably don't try that. Probably take it to somebody, and it's not a lot of labor. They're probably not going to charge you a lot to put in a 3.5 connector. If they know what they're doing, they can probably do it in 5 minutes. But if you don't know what a connector is, you probably shouldn't do it, right? If you understand and you completely disassemble Glocks, you know every part, know what it is, really not that hard to put in a different part. Again, make sure you test it. Test it even more if it's for defense rather than just for fun. Also, if you care about how a gun looks, and I mean some people really care if the guns have marks on them, aesthetic things. I'm not that guy. Like I got an STI for duty carry in 2011. One of the first things I did when I got it was take a Dremel to it because I know how my hands like to interact on a gun, and I knew that there was a part on there that I didn't like, so I took a Dremel to it. You know why? Because it was to save my life for other people's lives, and I didn't care about it having a blemish because I took a Dremel to it. Some people would have a heart attack if you took a Dremel to their STI Staccato 2011. I don't care. So know that about yourself. If you need a new set of sights on like a dovetail, whether it be a rifle or a handgun, let's say that 1911 has got Novak style sights, which is real common. If you care about having dings on your slide, probably don't go beating on it with a hammer and a brass punch. It's probably not going to hurt your gun at all as far as function, but yeah, you might have some big brass scrapes on your slide. I personally don't care. But if you do, take it to a gunsmith who's got a really nice sight pusher. Unless you want to just buy the sight pusher yourself, but they'll have a specific tool to like push one side out and push the other one in. I don't care. I'll beat on it with a hammer. I'll stand on it on the back of my tailgate with one leg up on it to hold the slide down and beat it with a hammer until I get the sight off. Because I'm not going to break the slide. I'm not going to bend the slide. I don't really care if I put a couple dings or dents in it. It's a working gun. If you care about that, pay somebody else to do it. When to DIY as far as like camo, if you've got an AR and you want a little bit more camo, because black is probably one of the worst colors for blending in with anything. If you're fine with just throwing some Krylon on it or some Rust-Oleum of different colors, and the whole point is to break up the outline so you don't get spotted, just hit it with some Krylon or some Rust-Oleum. Just put some tape around the muzzle of your AR and spray paint. The whole point is to break up the outline. Now, if you want some kind of Gucci flage, you want like black multicam or alpenflage or whatever you want, and you want it to look pristine, then by all means take it to somebody and have them hydro dip it or do a proper high volume, low pressure kind of actual spray who knows what they're doing and aren't going to get runs in it. No, by all means have somebody do it that does it all the time and knows how to do it well, and it will give you the result that you want if you care about the aesthetics of it. And I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list of everything you could possibly do to any gun, like recrowning, rechambering, all that kind of stuff. What are the consequences? Is it worth it? What are my potentials for messing it up? It's kind of weigh that. Both legal ramifications, safety ramifications. I would say don't ever modify a gun to make it unsafe. If you're thinking about doing a modification that may make the gun explode, probably don't do that modification. If you're talking about a modification that may make the gun less reliable, what's the intent of the gun? Again, if it's shooting prairie dogs and you just get a click instead of a bang, not that big a deal. Maybe go one step higher in the spring weight next time. If it's for defense, maybe don't make that trade. If you just spent, $1,500 on a rifle and $1,500 on a scope, on an optic, and you don't have a torque wrench, probably take that in and have a professional mount it level and plumb and to the proper torque spec. If it's on, let's say, a 22 and the scope is $40, and if you mess it up, what you're like, okay, if I mess it up, if I ruin the scope, I'll chalk it up to a learning experience and I'm out $40. Then maybe do it yourself. And I guess one other thing I should mention that I didn't really get into, but what are the financial ramifications? I touched on it with the scope. Like if you ruin the scope and it's a $1,500 scope, even if you can send it in and have them replace it, repair it, fix it, because they have a great warranty, you're still going to be out of it for that amount of time. Or if it's something like a Glock and you don't know what you're doing and you want to do a stipple job, which is something real common back in the day we would do before Glock got the better texturing, we would literally take a hot iron or a soldering iron or a hot piece of metal and or some kind of sand and put a better texture on the gun. If you do that on a Glock and you ruin the frame, well, that's a serialized gun part of the gun. You can't just go buy another frame. So if you're thinking about stippling on a 320, that's a different matter, because if you mess up the 320 grip when you're stippling it, you just buy another grip because it's not the actual frame serialized part of the gun, right? So same exact kind of gunsmithing job. It's no harder to stipple a 320 than it is a Glock 19. But if you mess one up, you're maybe out, $500-600? If you mess the other one up, you're out $40, $50, $60? So, and these are just rough numbers. I don't know when you're going to listen to this or what the actual prices are, but you get the idea. You're dealing with way more of a cost. If you mess it up, are you going to have to buy a whole new gun, or is it just a cheap part? Here's an example. I've mounted a lot of optics before, both being employed as a professional gunsmith and just on my own. Sometimes some things don't always play well together. Not all the components, even if they're supposed to, play well together. Right? What are we talking about doing? If we're talking about doing, drilling and tapping a receiver of a rifle, I can literally ruin that gun doing that. If we're talking about me taking a file or machining a scope mount that costs, or a base of a scope that costs $10, right? Okay, if I mess it up, fine. I'm even willing if I mess 3 of them up to get one that works. If I got to throw this thing in a drill press and hog it out and I mess up 3 of them but I get one that works and I'm out $30, I don't care. Whereas I wouldn't do that same thing even if I was doing a similar operation. I'm not going to do that with the receiver of the rifle, because if I mess that up even once, that whole rifle is destroyed. You get the idea there. Like, what happens if I mess it up? Also, you might want to think about if you can even get another part, right? Not all guns are easy to get parts for. If you're talking about a Glock or an AR-15, you can probably get a part. If it's something weird or proprietary or really old and antique, if you mess it up, can you even get another part? Like, I have an old AH Fox. Side by, you don't have to know that it's an old side-by-side, literally, I think, well over 100 years old. My one family heirloom passed down from my grandfather. Old side-by-side shotgun. It literally got to the part where it was unsafe, where if you shut the gun, the barrels would go off. Right? That's not cool. Can't have that. Well, I opened it up and it had some old archaic kind of leaf spring that's, not made. In that case, I had to fashion one out of a mainspring from a 1911. And it works fine now. It's totally safe, and it works the way that it was intended to. That was a lot of work and a lot of hand fitting and hand filing. In that case, I couldn't really use the shotgun because you don't want a shotgun that goes off, sometimes both barrels, when you shut it. That's not good. However, if I had just wanted a lighter trigger pull, if the gun functioned fine and it was safe, I probably would not want to do anything with any of those springs like that in that gun, because even at the time, those were individually hand fit and made parts. If the gun works, I might be better selling that to somebody, as long as it's not a family heirloom or something. If it was just a random shotgun and I didn't like it, maybe sell it to somebody who's going to appreciate it for what it is and get one that better fits me. Like if you're talking about just an off-the-rack Remington 870 shotgun, because shot fit is important. Natural point of aim on a shotgun is important. If a 870 stock doesn't fit you and you want to just literally take a sawzall to it and cut it off and refit the butt pad on it, okay, fine. Not a big deal. If you mess it up, you can buy another stock. If you mess that one up, you can buy another stock, and they're not expensive. And if you get an old 100-year-old Parker, side-by-side shotgun with the original beautiful wood stock, you probably don't want to go cutting that with a sawzall or a circular saw or any other kind of saw, because that company's no longer in existence. They don't make those stocks anymore. And even if they did, that one's probably hand-fitted to that gun. So if that stock doesn't fit you, again, unless it's like a family heirloom you don't really want to sell, you may just, let's say if you discover that you bought this gun and it doesn't really fit you, seeing if you can trade it in for something else to a shotgun, if you want an old classic shotgun to, let's say, go rabbit hunting, to one that actually fits you and has natural point of aim, instead of cutting up the original stock on a 100-year-old gun. You get the idea. You'll see this on there was an era when, a lot of GIs, a lot of servicemen after World War II brought a lot of guns back because they were allowed to back then. Or there was just a flood on the market. You could just buy cheap surplus guns, and they were a lot cheaper than getting a bolt-action hunting rifle from the store. Well, there were a lot of, let's say, beautiful 1903 Springfields that somebody literally cut the stock with a saw, and they maybe did drill and tap the receiver. They may have cut down and recrowned the barrel, because at the time those things were a dime a dozen. But now they're not. And the originals in the original condition are worth way more money. So even the same gun in a different era, did it make sense for them to do that? Yeah, if they needed a deer hunting rifle to feed the family and that's what they could afford, and there was a ton of them, yeah. But I would never advise you today to get an original 1903 Springfield and do those things to it, because you can't just go and buy an original spare, readily available bunch of parts like barrels and stuff for those guns. You may find one, but not easily. And a lot of those things are serialized to the gun. So think about the long-term ramifications too. If you mess this up and you decide you don't like it and you want to go back, can you? Or if you mess up this part, can you even get another one? Maybe it's some, gun that, in the middle of the 20th century, there was a lot of these like Sears guns, Western Auto, things like that were maybe similar but not the same to another gun. If it's a part, like let's say you've got this old on a 30-30 lever action. So lever action is a hard gun to work on anyway internally. Pretty actually complex inside. You decide, you know what, I want to try and do a trigger job on this. I'm going to file down a bunch of these parts. If you file down that part too far and it no longer functions, can you, other than getting somebody to CNC machine you a new part, which is probably going to cost as much or more than the entire gun, you know what I'm saying? Probably just deal with the trigger that it has. You get what I'm saying there? Can you even get a new part for it? And I guess if you have enough money, you could always get a new part, because you could just get somebody to make you one. You can machine it out of a solid bar of, bar stock. But you get what I'm saying? You can't just get on eBay and order a spare part. So think about the long-term ramifications if you mess up a modification, if you can't get another part easily. Okay, I think that will about do it on the modifications, when you should and should not modify a gun, when you should do it yourself or pay somebody else to do it. This tactical tip, if you do a lot of gun work, this one tactical tip could save you a lot of money. So I'm just going to tell you, consider becoming a patron. Just on the little bit of value you get from this one episode, let alone a bunch of episodes, consider becoming a patron and supporting the show. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. Actually, I'm going to give you several, and each one of these are probably worth several months of Patreon. The big one is, if you're ever taking apart or putting a gun back together and you get frustrated, stop, walk away, right? Go get a cup of coffee, go for a walk around the block, go pet your dog, go take a shower, whatever you do to unwind. Go do some push-ups, do something. Don't continue to work on that gun and get frustrated and break something, or throw it across the room, or do something you're going to regret later. If you're getting frustrated, take a break. Because you try and force something that's just not going, and you know it's not supposed to be hard, but it's hard, you're doing something wrong, you're going to break it. You really have the potential to break something if you get frustrated. In general, guns go together in a certain manner pretty easily. So if something seems like it should be going and it's not going, instead of just getting mad trying to force it, take a break. Take a step back. That in and of itself can really save you a lot of heartache. Ask me how I know. Also, if you're dealing with something with a lot of little small parts, two things. Get a magnetic bowl if you can. Put the little parts in a magnetic bowl. And or if you're taking parts out or putting them back in and they're really small, try doing it over top of or inside of even a plastic bag. If you're dealing with little tiny springs, I'm talking about like tinier than your pinky nail, and they go shooting off into shag carpet somewhere, if you still got shag carpet or wherever, and it's not an easily, you don't just have a stockpile of those parts. You can either spend half a day on your hands and knees crawling around looking for that spring, or getting a magnet and looking for that spring, or you could take your time, go get a plastic bag and or a magnetic bowl and do it that way. Again, that tip in and of itself can really save you a lot of frustration. Your tactical verse of the day. One thing that will serve you well in life, period, but especially serve you well in gunsmithing, working on guns, is patience. That said, your tactical verse of the day is going to be Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. Now, how does that start? That is part of Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. We often want God to hear us when we cry out and answer us, but how often do we want to be patient and wait for it? Wait patiently for the Lord. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.